Hello everybody. So today I will be answering your questions. Before I get started, I want to let you know that I tend to be a fairly nervous speaker. That's actually one of the reasons why I got into writing in the first place. So if at any point you want me to reiterate in a later video, I will be more than happy to do that. So I had questions from quite a few viewers as of late, and even though as a general rule I would be posting this in written format, today I thought this would be a good opportunity to answer you verbally. So let's get started on this. So my first viewer, or my first questioner I should say, comes from a person by the name of Trevor Backett. His question is, what do you hope your readers take away from your writing? So he's asking me because he is himself interested in creating his own novels, and I guess he knows about my experiences in that field. I guess what he wants to ask is, when you write a work of fiction, what kind of emotion should your viewers get? Well, Trevor, I think that for starters, when you write a novel, you should be investing your own personality into it. And by that I mean, you should essentially risk that the people who read your content will, for example, they'll see your interest or affection for nature, or perhaps they'll see you becoming more teary-eyed if a character you care for dies. So, and that's one of the things that comedians also do. They always have to put themselves out there on the front line, and then they have to risk the possibility that they'll be laughed at, but in return their investment is that they're also more likely to self-improve over time, and people will also be able to relate to it a lot more. Because the problem is that a lot of writers, they try too hard to play it safe, in that they do not want to embarrass themselves, so to speak, by submitting their own personal lives into a book. But the problem is, when they don't do that, then they don't know what exactly it is that the viewer should be reacting for. So I guess what that means is that if I'm not exactly certain how to explain this, but if you yourself are going to be upset by something that happens in the book, and you know that happens to you in your life, then chances are that a lot of viewers will also have that same reaction. But if you yourself essentially put yourself in a situation where you do not feel upset, then you cannot know how your viewers are going to feel about it. I'm not exactly certain if I explained that well, but if Trevor sees this question later on, I hope that he'll push a little bit more. I can try and explain it in better detail later on. So he also asked me a second question. How did you come up with your story's concept? This is actually kind of an interesting question, because until very recently I used to always believe that the characters and plots that I came up with were purely original. And while I still believe that the interpretation of those characters is completely something that I came up with on my own accord, I also have come to the conclusion that a lot of ideas and personality traits that are displayed in my novels actually come from people that I knew in real life. For example, I might have one character, they might have a quirky or awkward personality, and then I would always think that I must have invented them on my own. But then later on, I found out by just going back by going through the memories of my early life, I started to realize that a lot of these characters, for some reason, they were displaying a lot of the same personalities of people that I had already known. That's not to say that the characters are completely life-based, because as I said, I was able to later reinterpret those characters to make them more fictionalized. But I also ended up inadvertently creating plots and characters that were based on real life. And that also applies to history books. And that's why I think that if you want to get into plot making, reading a lot of history books actually does help, because you can see real life stories as they happen, and so you can read the real life stories as they happen, and then you can make them into a fictionalized setting. So for example, if you want to write a war book, you can read a lot of books on World War I, and you can see a lot of the stories that came from that period, and then you can take all the general stories from different veterans, so to speak, and you can make a novel out of that. And I'm very sorry to say this, I write a lot better at this point, but I hope I'll get better at speaking over time. So to make this question short and simple, what I suggest you do is that you read a lot of history books, you study human behavior, you go back on your own life and you say to yourself, this person had an interesting trait about them. What if I were to take that trait and this trait, mix them together in a plot line that's perhaps completely different to our real world timeline? And then you say, how would this character behave? And you just base it on different humans. It's kind of like a lot of drawers and painters. They always look at references from other periods of time, and then they end up making their own art out of it. I think it was Picasso who once said that the great art is still, and now that I'm seeing for myself that a lot of characters and concepts came right out of the history books or real life encounters that I've had, I'm starting to believe that as well, so to speak. Thank you, Jenner. So my next viewer is someone by the name of Huerta Teresa. I think that's what her name is pronounced. Correct me if I'm wrong. Her question number 3 is, what are the steps to be taken before choosing a business? So I think what she's trying to ask me is how do you decide what business you want and what steps must be taken? Well, first of all, I think the obvious that you have to find something that you're passionate about, something that you believe you can have a market for, and then you have to do some research. You have to look at other people who are in that same field as yourself. And you must, for example, read the same book materials, do the same interviews, and then you essentially learn from them. So if, for example, we want to get into computer design, perhaps best advice is to look at the lives of Bill Gates or Steve Jobs and see what they did, see what they did right, see what they did wrong. And then you try to tell yourself, what exactly have they done? What exactly can you do that they have not done? And that is also marketable. If you can find something like that and you are convinced that you have an idea that a lot of people are going to admire, then that's the route I suggest you take. Now, if you want to get into writing, which is what I do, then I would say that the best advice is that you have to practice writing. You can read books. You look at what the authors have written, and you look at their sentence structure, and you tell yourself what works and what doesn't work. If the plot development isn't good, is the character not good? Is it maybe a combination of both? A lot of people, they like to always read the classics, but sometimes the best advice in the reading field is also to read books that are less well received, because in that way you can look at what was done wrong and you can try to correct that behavior through the experience of others. I think that covers it. But if I haven't answered your question, please feel free to contact me later. So the next question is from Jeff McKenzie. So question number 4 is, how did the communist and fascist movements manifest themselves in Ireland between the 2 world wars? Which Irish factions aligned with which movement? So I guess what he's more or less asking me is what exactly, just to be sure. Yeah, so he's asking me essentially the history of far left and far right Irish uprisings between 1918 and 1939. To be quite honest, I'm not the best expert on that topic, but I do know a few interesting details. For example, I know that when I read a book about the Easter uprisings and the Irish Civil Wars, one interesting tidbit of information was that I think it was within Sinn Féin, S-I-N-N space F-E-I-N. If you were a junior officer, the way you got to become company leader was that essentially you had to be voted in by the men you were to be commanding. So some bizarre revolutionary concept, I guess. Becoming an officer was regarded as a full democratic right, at least at the lower ranking levels. I don't think it applied to those at the senior levels, but hey, I guess that was more than what someone could have expected in just about any other army of that period. And if I look back from the 19th century, what I've noticed is that there's always been a lot of conflict between Irish and Protestant Irish immigrants. In Canada, for example, there was something called the Fenian Raids. The last major episode of this took place in 1866, and that was done, I guess, in an attempt to turn Canada into a Republican state because they were very anti-monarchist. Perhaps this was in regards to the potato famine that had struck their homeland 2 decades later, and so a lot of people there were most likely quite embittered about that situation. But then between 1936 and 1939, during the Spanish Civil War, there was reportedly a lot of Irish people from both sides. Some of them fought for the nationalists under Francisco Franco, and then there were others who fought for the Republicans. Ultimately, as I'm sure you know, the nationalists ended up winning the war, but what it shows is that the Irish have a history of not only fighting within their homeland, but of also taking their conflicts in other countries and hoping that whatever ideology they're supporting will somehow prevail and perhaps change the course of their own situation back in their own homeland. Actually have perhaps sometime in the future, if anybody's interested, I could definitely make a more concrete video on this topic. I just wanted to go over some of the basics because I understand that I have upwards of 30 questions to be answering, and I do not want to take up too much of your time. But aside from that, I also know that within Sinn Féin itself there was a lot of conflict because in the earlier years, James Connolly and R.C. Griffith, despite their oppositions to one another, R.C. Griffith being anti-communist and Connolly being pro-communist, they were able to cooperate together. But then once both of them were deceased and Michael Collins came into power, I guess he essentially tried to move away from the more socialist aspects that James Connolly himself tried to lead in the Easter uprisings of 1916. So as you can see, a lot of the alliances one day they kind of break apart, and then the next day they're fighting against each other. I guess that's was a characteristic that was commonplace in Russia during the revolutionary years, and then during that same period in Ireland, they had something just like it. So, Nick Adams. Alright, so Lynn Adams, on her question number 5. What historical age is your favorite to study? Why? Well, I've studied just about every period to one extent or another, from the Bronze Ages up to modern times. In my earlier years, I always dedicated myself to mostly studying, exclusively studying North American and European history. But as I got into my high school years, I decided that I wanted to broaden the scope of my knowledge, so I began studying Oriental history. At the time, it was mostly dedicated to Japanese, Korean, and Chinese history, but then later on, I also took an interest in studying Southeastern history and Indian history. Because, quite frankly, I don't know if I'm so much interested in a certain period as much as I'm interested in a theme in history, so to speak. For instance, legal history, that interests me. I've always been intrigued of how people from one period to another dealt with so-called criminal offenders within their own justice system. I definitely have and then I mean to say that I definitely want to make more videos on that topic, because I think that I have some interesting facts that I think a lot of people would be interested in reading about, or viewing. People can read stuff on Core or other writing sites later on. And then there's also perhaps other social causes, such as how like voting rights or healthcare, or perhaps even how warfare is conducted. These are all topics within history that are interesting to me, but they're not necessarily limited to a certain time period. But if I were to choose, I would probably say that in some ways I kind of like modern history better. And that's because I feel that we're actually living in that time period. I know that the Bronze Ages and the Roman period and the medieval era, essentially made the foundation for what our 21st century world is like. But I still think that from a historical perspective, at least for me, I'm living in this period. I did not live 600 years ago, so I could look back on it later on and say, well, I think this happened, or I think that the average person would have seen life in this manner. But I cannot know that with absolute certainty. What I can do is I can look at our time right now and say, this is what happened, this is how I felt, and essentially have a first-hand account on what happened in 2022. And then people who will study our era 100 or 200 years from now, they'll be able to appreciate first-hand knowledge that came from just your average regular citizen. That was something that was not available 2,000 years ago, when literacy was limited to only a small elite class of educated people, such as kings and monarchs, who, quite frankly, would not have known what a person of low economic status during their period was going through, or what they were truly thinking. Question number 6. Which head of government of any country right now do you think will go down in history as a great leader? Oh, I know that in past history, for example, ancient Macedonia, they had their Alexander the Great. Ancient Egypt, they had their Ramses the Great. Korea, they have their Gwanggaeto and Sejong the Great. And Persians, they had their Xerxes the Great. And the Kievan Rus had their Vladimir the Great, essentially. And then the Persians even had their Frederick the Great. But if you look at the trend, you will also notice that all the greats in history, they've been emperors. They lived in a time period that was particularly chaotic, and just as often as not, they were also the ones who perpetrate their own military conflicts. For example, a lot of Chinese, they still regard someone like Qin Shi Huang to be a fairly great ruler, but as I'm sure that anybody who studied Chinese history knows, he was also quite ruthless in how he unified the other states. Even in India, Ashoka the Great, he also had, in his earlier years, he had also been known for his conquests. He eventually gave up on that, but as I said, these rulers, they had to do a lot of things that people in the modern age just wouldn't stand for. If, let's say tomorrow, somebody like Joe Biden said he wanted to forcibly annex Canada and Mexico, a lot of people today, they'd think that he was a tyrant. They probably would not think very highly of him, and yet, quite ironically, the people who are most remembered in history who are regarded as high status in history are the kinds of people that today we would probably hate. Genghis Khan, he largely wiped out most large portions of Central Europe, Asia, and Eastern Europe. According to some historians, he may have killed anywhere between 40 to 50 million people, which is could be on par with the Soviet era. And that's even when you account for the fact that the populations in those regions were much smaller than they are today. And yet we have restaurants on Genghis Khan. We even have movies that depict him as a great ruler. And so in some bizarre way, I almost think that in 100 or 200 years from now, when people living today are not going to be around, and people in the future won't be personally impacted by this, I believe that's quite possible that someone like Hitler or Stalin, they could very well be regarded as the great by future historians, just because they came at a time when they will both be seen as people who came from fairly obscure backgrounds. They rose to power, they went on military conquest, unified their states, and turned into a superpower status. Stalin far longer than Hitler, of course, but at the end of the day, they're going to be known for being the people that we essentially admire past rulers for doing. Whether that's a sad fact or not, I mean, it's just how it is from a historical perspective. Nobody remembers the average monarch who just peacefully ruled their small kingdom and then went off into historical obscurity. We remember the ones that went and invaded other states and then turned themselves into a superpower. So, and suffice to say, in our so-called modern democratic societies, that's not exactly something that a leader is supposed to be doing. So I don't think that then 200 years from now, anybody who's living right now is going to be remembered as I think that, if anything, historians looking back on our era, which apparently is considered one of the most stable in modern history, will say to themselves that this is like one of the most unremarkable periods in political history. I think that somebody like Theodore Obiang and Nguema Mbasogo of Equatorial Guinea, or perhaps Paul Biya of Cameroon, who have been ruling their countries since 1979 and 1982 respectively, they might have a far better chance of being regarded as the great simply because they've been around for so much longer. In the United States, the average president is only around for about 4 years, and a lot of other European societies, their prime ministers or presidents don't even last that long. So, I think that chances are, not even know if anybody in our era is going to be regarded as the great, but you never know. I know that in Ukraine right now, there's a lot of conflicts going on between Putin and Zelensky, so perhaps in 2023 or 2024, we're going to have a major conflict, and then some world leader, whether it's Biden, Bolsonaro, or even the newly elected Sunak of the United Kingdom, they perhaps will turn out to be far more competent military leaders than they're currently laying on. And as I said, historically speaking, those are exactly the kind of people who are later were given the title the Great. Chris Baco, he asks, question number 7. Where does Marxism fail at, be it economically, philosophically, or politically? Well, I think on economic level, I presume that most people understand that when you have a government that more or less tells everybody that they're going to be given a certain economic salary no matter what they say or do, that's in itself not exactly a good start. That's not to say that laissez-faire capitalism on the other extreme isn't necessarily any better for your average person, but I'm just saying that just because one extreme is bad doesn't necessarily mean that somehow the other extreme is less so. I know that in theory, communist societies rarely even bother to give an equal salary. It oftentimes comes down to your class background and employment. For example, in Soviet society, Lenin had installed the working class and then the farmers class. The working class, they were the people who lived in the city. They did the industrial work, the teaching, more or less the kind of white-collar jobs that people here in modern North America and Europe that are commonplace in modern Europe and North America. Whereas the peasants, they were the blue-collar workers. Those were the people who worked in farms, worked in mining, or in lumbering. In the lumber sector, they were oftentimes told that they couldn't even leave their villages, I think until at least after 1976, when Brzezinski initiated some reforms that continued until well into the Gorbachev era. And the worst part is that there was no way you could move up from those rankings. It was kind of like a case system. If you were told by the Soviet government that your background was from a peasant family, which was oftentimes used to inflict punishments on those who had been regarded as bourgeoisie in the pre-revolutionary era, you had no chance of becoming a member of the working class. Your life was in this village, and because you were prohibited from leaving that small sector, you more or less would live and die within eyesight of your own birth, having never stepped outside of that boundary. So needless to say, it was a very restrictive system, and whether or not Karl Marx himself would have agreed to this concept, at the end of the day, he was also quite willing to, he was also himself quite, I'm sure I would say this, he was quite dismissive of any sort of human rights regarding the average person, because his concern was largely in favor of the working class. But in his defense, Karl Marx had also apparently written the Communist Manifesto with the belief that, if anything, a country like the United Kingdom or a somewhat more industrialized nation would be the ones where communism prevailed. Ultimately, and historically speaking, that has never been the case, but as I said, whether or not Marx himself would have approved of a Leninist-style government is something that we will probably never know in our lifetimes. Question number 8. What is your opinion on the Vatican II? So, for those who do not know, Vatican II was a series of reforms that came about between 1962 and 1965. They were done under the guidance of Pope John the 23rd, but after his death in 1963, Pope Paul VI presided over the later reforms. Some of which included that women no longer had to cover their hair while in church, because historically speaking, they typically wore hats. The clergy, rather than facing from the congregation would face towards them, and people who did not understand Latin had a much easier time getting into Mass because now the priests were allowed to speak in the vernacular of the people who were listening to them. So if you were in French, you got the priest would, instead of speaking to you in Latin, he would speak to you in your own native tongue. If you were English, the same applied. And if you were Spanish or Portuguese, the priest spoke to you in Spanish and Portuguese respectively. I think personally, overall, I agreed with these new changes to the system. Perhaps there are some other factors or details that I'm overlooking that perhaps would persuade me to look into the matter further. But in all fairness, in the 21st century, when Latin was becoming largely irrelevant, so to speak, for the average person, I do not think that they would have gotten very much out of sitting at church, as they would not have understood anything that was being said to them. At that point, they may as well just stayed at home and read their own Bibles, and they would have had a far better understanding about it than a priest could hope to provide. But that's only regarding the religious perspective. From a historical perspective, I do believe that in some ways there is an unfortunate side to essentially dismantling Latin as a mandatory tongue, because a lot of documents from history, from Europe to North America, and perhaps even other corners of the world, were written in Latin. That's because it was regarded as a universal language in much the same way that English is today. Imagine if 200 or 300 years from now, perhaps English became extinct. A lot of information that we today take for granted would not be available for later historians or even scientists to take advantage. And that's, I think, is something that perhaps concerns a lot of people who want to ensure that the tongue does not completely die off, because a lot of documents and past historical information that we were able to later translate into our own languages comes from Latin. And regarding the turning the priest over to the altar to face the congregation, I don't necessarily see anything wrong with that, because according to the Bible itself, apparently God is everywhere, so he's not necessarily standing at the back of the church like what was traditionally said to be the case. He's apparently standing all amongst us, so if a priest wants to turn around and perhaps make the service more personal, well, who's to say that that's not what Jesus would not have wanted to have anyway. So my next question is from Robert Gould. He's asked question number 9. Is European civilization approaching its collapse? Well, I think that in recent years, the continent has no doubt seen a lot of political strife. Whether or not this is something that will eventually heal can only be determined by the later events that will undoubtedly follow. But if you're asking in regards to the recent immigration of non-Europeans, I do not necessarily think it is anything critical, at least not at this time. Historically speaking, there have been quite a few non-European nationalities that have made their way over into the continent, and as far as I'm concerned, Europe has managed to hold its own. In about 1,000 years ago, before the Crusader era, about a third of the region had been annexed forcibly by the Moors and other Islamic nations. And despite all the odds, we managed to the European civilizations, they managed to turn things around and keep themselves ahead until around the 17th century. They became more technologically advanced than any other continent on the face of the earth. Now, of course, in the last half century or so, this has slowly changed, and perhaps by the end of the century, Europe itself will be far behind China or India in terms of its economic and technological developments. But as I said, throughout most of our history, Europe has long been behind its non-European counterparts when it comes to their development, and we have managed to survive. So I do not think it's necessarily anything to be alarmed about. Now, in all fairness, I do agree that some of the immigration policies, such as Angela Merkel, apparently, from what I understand, letting 1 million undocumented non-European just walk into Germany without any regulation, I think that was definitely a wrong call, and I believe that we're starting to see some of the negative effects from this now from people who